Professor Anton Zamloch. Have you heard of him? I had not. I stumbled across him by accident while doing research on a completely different topic. When he first arrived on the stage in 1872, audiences didn't know who he was. Instead of introducing himself, he adopted a mysterious, exotic persona, the Fakir of Arabia. It was the perfect identity for a man about to convince audiences that the impossible was real. As crowds grew and newspapers spread tales of his astonishing performances, the mysterious Fakir quietly disappeared. They simply announced Professor Zamloch, which changed to the Great Zamloch and Zamloch the Great. Newspapers called him a necromancer, a medium, an illusionist, a magician, a comedian, a storyteller, and even a spiritualist. If a magician came to your town claiming he can make impossible things happen, would you buy a ticket? I know I would. In 1881, Zamloch entered a newspaper office in southern Utah to pump up publicity for his upcoming shows. Imagine you're an editor, sitting there talking with another editor. There's 3 unopened quarts of whiskey and a large box of cigars on the desk. Then, there's not. Silence. The editors didn't laugh and didn't applaud. Furious, they accused him of stealing it and reached for their guns. He returned the bottles and cigars back to the editors. And somehow, that wasn't even the strangest thing Anton Zamloch ever did. Zamloch traveled into mining camps and frontier settlements, places where entertainment was rare and belief in the supernatural was still alive and unsettled. Audiences didn't just watch his tricks, they reacted to them as if they might be real. He traveled from Silver City, New Mexico to Winnemucca, Nevada, with a 16-mule freight train, leaving a 10-day trail of solid dust. He appeared in Tombstone, Arizona, before the infamous Birdcage Theater was built, performing his most famous act, blurring the line between illusion and the supernatural. One newspaper description of his performance in Tombstone, Arizona, reported, "His spirit rapping and other deceptions kept the audience in good humor." But what audiences saw was far more unsettling than good humor suggests. A rapping table and a drum that answered questions from the audience. In the late 1800s, this was the peak of America's obsession with spiritualism, when seances and ghost communication were widely believed, or at least seriously debated. Zamloch stepped directly into that cultural fear and turned it into theater. Before their eyes, people levitated, and a rope took on a life of its own in the Indian rope trick. Some of Zamloch's most haunting routines involved theatrical illusions that feel almost cinematic today. Newspapers described, "Skeletons do a buck and wing dance" to ragtime music. Imagine, you're sitting in the audience not sure what to expect, when suddenly skeletons come to life and start dancing on stage. Zamloch wasn't just performing tricks, he was performing belief systems. And oddly enough, the skeletons weren't even his weirdest performance. Imagine this. It's 1890. Electricity is still new. People are photographing ghosts. Families are holding seances in their parlors. Newspapers debate whether spirits are real. Then, a magician arrives, carrying a drum that answers questions. Enter the goblin drum. Suspended on a wooden frame where everyone could see it, the drum suddenly came alive. It rolled out military marches, answered questions from the audience with mysterious knocks, and somehow revealed the playing cards secretly chosen by audience members. No one could explain how an empty drum seemed to know the answers. Imagine walking into a packed opera house in the 1890s. Everything you're about to see happens right in front of hundreds of witnesses. You've heard the stories, but you wanted to witness it for yourself. One of his most talked about performances was something called the Enchanted Horse Trough. On stage sat an ordinary wooden horse trough. Volunteers poured bucket after bucket of water into it while the audience watched. Nothing suspicious so far. Then Zamloch picked up a fishing pole. Within seconds, he reeled in a large, dripping wet carp. Then another. The crowd laughed and applauded, convinced they'd figured out the joke. Then his assistant stepped forward. He cast his own line into the very same trough and slowly pulled out a rubber boot. Then, a dead cat. By now, the audience didn't know whether to laugh or gasp. And then came the finale. Something alive emerged from the water. A shrieking little devil clawed its way from the trough, splashing wildly as the audience erupted in chaos. Zamloch hurriedly shoved the creature back into the water before it could escape. Then, with one dramatic motion, he tipped the entire trough over. No water poured out, and nothing else either. The trough was completely empty and somehow perfectly dry. It became one of the biggest hits of his career, especially in Chicago, Omaha, and Kansas City. But perhaps even more incredible, people didn't always leave believing they'd watched a trick. Sometimes they believed the impossible had actually happened, as what happened after one performance in 1897. A woman marched straight to the local police. She insisted Zamloch had somehow stolen her wedding ring, without ever touching her. According to her, the ring had vanished from inside her gloved hand during the performance. A constable actually wrote to Zamloch afterward with an update. Later, the woman found the missing ring packed away inside her own trunk before leaving on a trip to Montana. The officer couldn't resist adding a little humor, writing that she believed Zamloch had reconsidered the matter and, using his great spirit powers, returned the ring overnight. It's hard to imagine today, but that's just how convincing his performances were. And then there was the illusion that audiences simply couldn't explain, the famous Indian basket trick. A large woven basket was placed high on 4 chairs where everyone could clearly see underneath it. Zamloch climbed inside. The lid was closed. The audience waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. The basket was opened, and it was empty. Then a voice suddenly echoed from somewhere behind the audience. "Hello!" Every head in the theater snapped around. There stood Anton Zamloch, smiling from the back of the auditorium while the empty basket still sat on stage. In another version, he climbed into an oversized champagne basket. A hand suddenly poked through the lid. A pistol fired. The audience jumped. Seconds later, before anyone had recovered from the gunshot, Zamloch greeted everyone from the theater's main entrance as if he'd simply walked in from outside. No one could explain that one either. And that uncertainty became his greatest illusion, because the best magicians don't just fool your eyes. They make you question your own memory, and for just a moment, whether magic might actually be real. There's a reason audiences stopped breathing the moment Anton Zamloch asked to borrow someone's hat. As in this particular hat, an expensive silk top hat. In the late 1800s, that hat might have cost someone a week's wages. If anything happened to it, there would be no laughing it off. So when Zamloch casually cracked several raw eggs directly into the hat, can you imagine the owner's expression? The audience gasped. Then Zamloch did the unthinkable. He lit a fire beneath the hat. Smoke curled into the air as the eggs actually began to cook inside the borrowed silk hat. People shifted nervously in their seats. But Anton Zamloch wasn't finished, as if cooking breakfast inside someone else's hat wasn't impossible enough. he suddenly began pouring steaming hot coffee out of thin air into a coffee cup. Then, with another flourish, cream appeared. The theater erupted into prolonged applause. And just when the owner was surely imagining the cost of replacing that ruined hat, Zamloch handed it back, spotless. Not a scorch mark, not an egg stain, no signs of smoke. The audience wasn't simply impressed, they were relieved. When Zamloch crossed into Mexico, somehow things became even stranger. The customs officials inspected his trunks. Equipment disappeared. Props disappeared. Nobody seemed interested in finding them. Unlike the whiskey this time, the missing objects weren't part of the act. Imagine you're eating lunch in a Mexican town, and suddenly a marching band, bullfighters, acrobats, and a mysterious magician parade passes your front door. He traveled with performing bullfighters in Mexico City. But, as time went on, the amount of bullfighters dropped. One there that stuck with him was the surprise at learning most theaters in Mexico had no seats, and the audience members rented them from furniture stores or brought them from home. By the time Anton Zamloch reached Hawaii, he wasn't just another traveling magician, he had become a legend. Locals even gave him a nickname, Zamaloka Kahuna. Kahuna is a Hawaiian word often used for a respected expert, priest, or keeper of secret knowledge, or black arts. For a magician, that was quite a title. The island's amusement-loving audiences packed the theater, and just like audiences everywhere else, everyone knew they were watching tricks. But real mystery wasn't whether they were tricks. They tried to figure out exactly how Zamloch accomplished the impossible. One of his most baffling performances was known as the Mystic Bouquet. A simple wooden disc sat on an ordinary table in full view of the audience. No wires, no hidden assistants. Yet at Zamloch's command, the wooden disc began rapping on the tabletop by itself. But Zamloch wasn't finished. From a single ordinary bottle, he began producing one impossible object after another. All the flags of nations around the world, flowing wine, long colorful ribbons, cigars, matches, all from the very same bottle. Each new item drew louder applause than the last. And by the time the curtain fell, the audience had reached the same conclusion as so many others before them. They knew they had witnessed trickery, but just couldn't explain it. Perhaps that's why, in Hawaii, Anton Zamloch wasn't remembered simply as a magician. He was remembered as Zamaloka Kahuna. And then he vanished. Why did history forget someone who seemed to be everywhere? Anton Zamloch did something none of his audiences expected. He stopped. Not because he'd been exposed, not because someone finally figured out his secrets. Amazingly, some of his best tricks were never discovered. After spending 40 years of crisscrossing North America, carrying an entire theater in wagons and train cars, he said the age of motion pictures was approaching. He retired in Oakland, California, and became a beekeeper as a hobby, keeping 50 hives. The curtain fell, and it stayed down. But maybe the story didn't really end there. His son, Carl Zamloch, inherited at least some of his father's love of performing. As a boy, he was one of his father's assistants, and as a young man, he experimented with magic himself. But his first love was baseball. Carl became a professional pitcher, playing for the Detroit Tigers before later becoming one of the most respected college baseball coaches in America. It's hard not to wonder if growing up backstage, watching audiences gasp, taught him something about performing under pressure. Anton spent a lifetime creating illusions. The tricks are mostly forgotten now. The secret of the dancing skeletons and the rapping drum trick disappeared with the man who built them. But thanks to hundreds of fading newspapers, we can still catch glimpses of a performer who once convinced frontier audiences that almost anything was possible. If you enjoy historical mysteries with a touch of the paranormal, or ghost stories and legends and wish for more, please like and subscribe. I'll make more. Thanks for watching.